want to say that I'm actually incredibly excited to be here with Wired at the Skywalker Ranch. It's like two lifelong obsessions coming together. This is my office in Copenhagen. We're inside a Carlsberg factory where they used to make the least interesting part of the beer, the bottle cap. We're also in New York. These are my American colleagues. We are architects, but we also do haircuts. Basically the way we work is that we always try to mine as much information out of a situation before we intervene. In a way, we start looking for what could be the greatest potential or what could be the biggest problem. And then we use that information to inform our design decisions. So they're not arbitrary stylistic choices. They're always informed by something specific. And I'll just give you two examples. We did a sports hall in my old high school. And we could either put it on the football fields or in the middle of the courtyard. But in Denmark, football is the national sport. So it would be like a political suicide to put it there. So we had to dig it under the courtyard. And it's a handball hall. And on the perimeter, you need 15 feet of clearance. And in the middle, you need 25 feet of clearance. And actually, we got the commission from my old math teacher. So as a sort of homage, we based the architecture of the dome on the mathematical formula for a ballistic arch. So the sort of graceful curvature of the glue lamp beams is actually shaped by the mathematics of the sport. Everything you see here is actually, it's not designed, essentially it's just simply tracing the sort of the natural geometry of a thrown handball. And as a result, it leaves an imprint up in the courtyard. It becomes like this informal furniture that has actually sort of invited people to start hanging out. So like almost like this sort of cascade of effects, this like basic tracing of the mathematics of handball suddenly creates this new space in the courtyard. Another example is Hamlet's Castle Kronborg, north of Copenhagen. It recently became UNESCO World Heritage, and the Danish Maritime Museum used to be inside the castle. But they had to put it somewhere else, and they suggested put it inside the dry dock where they used to build ships. And it was kind of a dilemma because UNESCO said that we couldn't stick out of the ground as much as a foot to not block the view of the castle. But of course, the museum wanted some kind of an architectural masterpiece to attract people to come and check it out. So we got this idea to use the museum as a way of preserving the dock, turning the dock inside out. We turn it into a giant void. All we have to do is design a series of bridges, one that stops the water from coming in, one that connects over to the castle, and then one that sort of takes you down into the museum. We could actually build all of the bridges in a Chinese shipyard and then sail them in and click them into place. So in a way, the architecture is completely sort of manifesting all of the aspects of shipbuilding, from the steel of the bridges to the concrete of the dock. You have this sort of descent through different spaces of intimate scale and vast scale. You get this like clash of the old and the new, the lightness of the steel and the glass clashing with the heaviness of the concrete. And in a way, this is the grown-ups auditorium that sort of extends under the stage and becomes an auditorium for the kids. The dock extends into the restaurant. And you have this sort of a whole sort of coexistence of the sort of the Shakespearean heritage on one hand, and this is like ultra-contemporary universe below the horizon. This is sort of an inverse Titanic moment, looking into and essentially, like once we've defined what the key criteria is, like the proximity to the UNESCO heritage, we don't necessarily have the answer. It's just a question we formulated. So we have to do tons of models. We always have to like make tons of models to test it. And sometimes we make huge models, and sometimes we make the models out of Lego. So like if you just go around our office, everything is sort of Lego everywhere. Even our signage is made out of Lego. So when we got approached by Lego, actually Lego made one of our buildings in the Lego store. We're not going to file a suit. It's actually the highest compliment you can get as an architect. But when they approached us to look at making a Lego house, which would be sort of looking at all aspects of culture through the eyes of Lego, we were sort of incredibly excited. We went completely to town, and we really had to get this job. It's going to be like where Lego is from in Billund in Denmark. And essentially what really excites me about Lego is that Lego empowers children and everyone like playing with Lego to create their own world and then to inhabit it through play. And that's exactly what architecture is supposed to be about. It's, in a way, like finding ways to empower people to influence their physical environment so that they can actually live the life they want to live. The Lego house is under construction. This is me. This is like the foundations of like these concrete Lego bricks. This is me standing with all of the richest people in Denmark, the Lego family. And if you can't wait, it's going to open in 2 years. But if you can't wait, you can actually build it yourself. Sort of a way to sort of get people involved is this sort of idea of like crowdsourced design in a way. We did an urban space in Copenhagen, and it's in the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in all of Denmark. It consists of what we call the Red Square, the Black Market, and the Green Park. And you have 60 different nationalities living here, so the importance of the project was really to involve the local community and create a sense of ownership. So we got this idea that it would be strange if the Danes had done the best bench and the best trash bin and the best lamppost. So we reached out to the local community through different media and through meetings and had people recommend elements from their other home country. And the basic idea is that we don't eat Chinese food to be nice to the Chinese. It's because we crave Beijing duck or noodles or dumplings. And we didn't put a Moroccan fountain in the middle of Copenhagen to be nice to the Moroccans, but because they have an amazing heritage of architectural water features. So you have a Jamaican sound system. The neighbors hate it. A Thai boxing arena. You have Iraqi swings, litter boxes from Great Britain, bollards from Ghana, like bicycle racks from Finland. The sign on the Red Square is actually a sign from the Red Square. You have like an amazing Kazakh bus stop, way cooler than a typical Danish one. We found palm trees in China that actually grow in a Danish climate. This octopus like really sort of reveals the diversity of the neighborhood and the sort of impact of playing. When you look at the benches, this S-curved love seat from Mexico, where you can look the person you're sitting next to into the eyes. There's a Belgian bench where everybody looks away from each other. And like even down to the lighting, we have these neon signs that advertise stuff you can't buy in Denmark. This is a Qatari dentist, like something from the socialist countries. And we even made an app so people can get the stories of the different objects. And in a way, like it really reminded us how like amazing it becomes when you outsource the creativity to the community to actually have a massive impact on their own environment. So we took this idea with us when, like you probably remember, like a bit more than 2 years ago, Sandy hit New York and caused a lot of devastation. It wiped out all of Lower Manhattan, creating a new neighborhood in Manhattan, Sao Paulo, south of Power. And essentially, like suddenly the Sandy happened because the sort of Atlantic hurricane belt is expanding because of rising temperatures. And because of the geometry of the New York Bight, you have this sort of 90-degree funnel shape. Like all of this sort of storm surge is sort of channeled into the most densely populated region in all of America, putting 50% of New York at risk. And if you look at this map of Lower Manhattan, you can see since the 17th century we've been expanding Manhattan through landfill. And this landfill is exactly the area that is now flood prone. So you can say the areas that we have been responsible for creating are also the ones where we need to take greater responsibility in protecting them. So the question is like, how can you protect all of Lower Manhattan without creating this seawall that segregates the life of the city from the water around it? And we thought maybe we could learn a little bit from the High Line. The High Line is a piece of decommissioned infrastructure that has now turned into one of the most popular promenades in New York City. And we were thinking, like, what if you can actually, instead of waiting for the infrastructure to get decommissioned before you add the program, what if you could actually think of the resilience infrastructure for Manhattan as sort of the dry line, to imagine it that it comes from day one with a lot of extra sort of positive social and environmental side effects. So when you look at the flood map, you have these like natural pinch points where the flooding doesn't get very far into the island because of the topography. So we use these as a way to create compartments, just like you have compartments in a ship. Each compartment can sort of be sort of solved on its own. And then when you look at the sort of urban development of New York, it's characterized by this David and Goliath encounter between Robert Moses, aka the power broker, and Jane Jacobs. Robert Moses, he did a lot of the necessary infrastructure investments of Manhattan, like a lot of the highways on the waterfronts, a lot of the social housing projects. But they were very, very top down. And they were like rarely very sort of instantly successful. They often like cut the people off from like different neighborhoods got cut off from each other, or like you couldn't reach the water. And one day he tried to cut a highway through Greenwich Village, and he met Jane Jacobs, who mounted this grassroots opposition, and eventually she defeated the plan, and Greenwich Village is still there. But we thought, you know, in this case, it could be interesting to think of this resilience infrastructure as the love child of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, because, you know, to provide 8 contiguous miles of waterfront protections, you need holistic, big picture perspective, but it needs to happen rooted in the local communities. And essentially, the main challenge is to resist a certain amount of storm surge, you need a certain geometry. But this geometry could be made in so many different ways, so that when you go there, you won't notice that this is actually part of a dam. It could be like a piece of landscape that also becomes what protects the city from flooding. It could be like various artworks, or like almost like furniture, landscaping. You could imagine like the median of the West Side Highway could become this art piece that also sort of protects the city from flooding. And as a way to do this, we went a step further. We went to the Lower East Side. Lower East Side was like really massively hit by Sandy. These are the areas that got flooded. And when you look at the 100-year flood and the 500-year flood, actually 2/3 of this neighborhood is flood threatened. It's a primarily residential neighborhood, and this is actually a map of all of the public housing or the affordable housing on Lower Manhattan. It's all inside this neighborhood. It's also the most ethnically diverse neighborhood. It's the most socially challenged neighborhood. It's like rather underserviced by public transportation, but in return it has a highway cutting it off from the waterfront. And even though it appears green, it actually has a lot less park than any other neighborhood in Manhattan. 95% of the surface is impervious, which also makes it more flood prone. And when you walk down the waterfront, you can see that it's like tortured by this sort of relationship to the infrastructure. So we sort of created this process where we sort of reached out to the local community. We had a series of workshops with the people from the Lower East Side, trying to test different ideas. We made this sort of smorgasbord of different solutions, and together we formulated a series of strategies. So one idea was in the East River Park, simply to create, raise the ground of the park to protect the park from the noise of the highway and also protect the city from flooding. It could be a phase 1 of a phase 2 to eventually submerge the park and integrate a new subway line underneath it, submerge the highway. We're sort of moving the bicycle lanes into the park side. The existing bridges that are these caged highway bridges become like high lines, sort of extending, we integrate ADA accessibility into the natural topography. You arrive in this like sloping park that takes you out into the water. We're also creating a 10th Street harbor bath, because the Hudson is actually, or the East River is so clean you can swim in it. Underneath the FDR, we got this idea to actually turn the underside of the FDR into some, like an asset. Like you have a lot of spaces in New York that are actually beautiful when you look up. So we got this idea of creating these art pieces hanging underneath the bridge. So, normally you just look up and you have like local artists, and it illuminates and make the underside more friendly. And then some of them can flip down and create temporary enclosures for like a Christmas market, or they can become what saves the city. Some places, all you need is actually 4 feet of height to resist the 50-year floodplain. So they can be like undulating benches serving different activities, and then they also becomes what saves the city, and they can serve as sockets for bigger flood barriers when you have a 100-year or a 500-year flood coming. Further down, we're proposing to create these little pavilions that animate the space underneath the canopy of the highway. So like galleries and markets that sort of make the underside more friendly and lively, but also protects the city from flooding. They're placed so that we never block the view from the side streets coming down to the water, so you always look uninterrupted down to the water. But then you have these like sliding walls that can come out and actually stop a flood from coming in. And finally, when you reach the south tip of Manhattan, we're working with the Battery Park to create sort of a series of little events in the park that creates a natural topography. We're sort of integrating a new harbor school and what we imagine to be a museum of cities on the water, where the big auditorium could actually be this like inverse aquarium, giving you a view into the different flood lines of different storms. So essentially the thinking is to take all of the hard infrastructure that is necessary to protect Manhattan from flooding, but then to always design it in close dialogue with the different residents of the different communities, so that as you move around, you won't sense that we've sort of incarcerated Manhattan in a flood wall, but we've actually sort of reanimated Manhattan so that when the next Sandy comes, it's going to remain a lively city. This project has just been sort of granted $335 million from the federal government, so we're going to start phase one. But I often get the objection that this is a little bit too much like science fiction. So just to give you an example of what we call social infrastructure that is actually happening right now. This is downtown Copenhagen. We're doing a waste-to-energy power plant that basically turns trash into electricity and district heating. When you look at it as a resource, 1 ton of trash equals 1 2/3 of an oil barrel in terms of energy. So it's a really valuable resource. But they operate on an economy of scale, so they're ugly boxes that cast shadows on the neighbors and block the views. This is going to be the biggest and tallest building in Copenhagen. So it's going to be right next to the marina, and it's going to be right where the local boys go water skiing. So we thought, like, in Denmark, we love skiing. We have snow, but we have absolutely no mountains. But we do have mountains of trash. So we thought we have to go to Sweden for 4 hours to Isaberg. But because of the sheer magnitude of this power plant, we can put 2/3 of Isaberg on top of the power plant. We know how big the machines are, so we decided this like sloping roof that has like an elevator takes you to the top of a green, a blue, and a black ski slope. We plant trees on top of the column, so it really becomes like a man-made mountain. Insanely, we won the competition based on this idea, so suddenly we had to figure it out. Just to give you a sense of scale, you can see this is an Olympic half-pipe. Some of you might have noticed that Denmark got 0 medals in Sochi. We hope to change that, because now we can actually practice at home. Also, for the people not skiing, there's a hiking path. You can do picnics. You can enjoy the view of your otherwise completely flat city. We're including the tallest climbing wall in the world, 300 feet for those who have the balls. Basically, like, the reason we could win the competition based on this idea, like, it's essentially turning the whole power plant into this man-made ecosystem where not only do we locally exploit the resources, also together with the city of Copenhagen, it becomes like an urban metabolism. But the reason we could win it was because this is going to be the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world. The smoke coming out of the chimney is completely non-toxic. It only contains a little bit of CO2 and some steam. So that's why you actually have fresh mountain air on top of this power plant. Normally you want to be as far away from a power plant as you can. Here it's actually completely clean. But finally, as a way to completely sort of configure the perception of a power plant, we've worked with Realities United and Copenhagen Suborbitals to design the chimney in a special way, so that basically it accumulates steam, and when, like at regular intervals, it puffs a gigantic smoke ring. So essentially, something that used to be a symbol of pollution becomes something playful. Of course, we couldn't find a smoke ring contractor, so we've been struggling quite a bit with figuring out how to do this. And just to finish off, we recently did a test at the end of August, trying to figure out how to do this, and this is how it went.
kraftedeme ikke noget at diskutere. Nu tror jeg sgu på det. Det er fandme godt. Ej, hvor er det vigtigt. Hvor er det vigtigt.
So, yeah, so I think maybe like the... I mean, I just think this smoke ring is maybe like a good symbol of what architecture is really all about. Because it is somehow this idea, like it has this element of world changing, that you take something that is like a wild idea, like pure fiction, and then you suddenly turn it into to hard fact. And I really like this idea that, you know, like when we came with this idea, everybody thought like that's insane. But then like in 2017, that's just how it is. You know, people who say like in Venice, people say in gondolas through streets of water. And in New York, people sort of inhabit the resilience infrastructure like pavilions or parks. And in Denmark, people ski on their power plants and they puff giant rings of steam. So in a way, architecture at its best is really the power to turn, you know, to make the world a little bit more like our dreams. Thanks.